Welcome back, Chappelle. All right, welcome back to your first flip of the new year. Yay, Pierre. Now, the big thing about it is, though, is this first flip is going to be a very important one, right? So this very first flip is going to have a lot of stuff that is kind of indicative of the rest of the school year, where we're not going to have necessarily everything written on the screen, right? We're going to have, like, all these other little things that you need to know, okay? So, for example, a lot of the stuff we're talking about in this flip is going to be on one of the short answers for your actual test that's coming up in a couple of weeks. So the big thing that you need to understand is that this is a very good flip to kind of understand that, like, we are learning things to learn them, not to memorize them, right? Same thing going forward with a lot of new standards in the class. So the big thing, though, we left off talking about the Spanish explorers in the Americas. So the very first couple of days back, we were talking a lot about Asia, and we were talking about the European explorers and their effects on India. Talking about the Portuguese, and then the Dutch come in, and then eventually the British, talking about the Dutch and British East India companies, and how they're going to make a ton of money in this whole process. Isn't that right, buddy? Now, the big thing, I've said big thing way too many times. So, importantly, we have also then began to talk about the Spanish and their conquest of the Americas. We talked about the Columbus and his effects on the Taino people. We talked about the major advantages that that the Spanish had over the natives. So two big things to make sure you have written down. And if you don't already have it written down, write it down somewhere in your notes right now. It's very important. The Spanish had forgeable metal or access to it throughout their history, and they also had large domesticated animals. The effects of these things mean that the Spanish are going to have weapons like guns, cannons, and things like that, swords, armor that the natives have no access to, and they're using usually rock or wooden type weapons, which of course these metal weapons are going to beat every time. And then the second thing the Spanish had that the natives didn't out of the Americas was large domesticated animals, things like cows and horses and pigs and chickens and stuff like that. That's going to affect the Spanish, especially the other Europeans, because it's going to actually expose them to certain diseases that the natives never encountered, like smallpox, measles, and influenza. So knowing those two things is a very good question of why things played out in history the way they did, instead of just they did, right? So going forward, we left off in class talking about those diseases. We left off talking about smallpox, measles, influenza, and how Columbus's journey alone is going to end up killing 90% of the people in the Caribbean, mostly due to infections via smallpox. Europeans had some immunity to smallpox, not much, but over 80% of people in Europe were exposed to smallpox at some point in their life, whereas the natives had no exposure to it whatsoever. Now, going into it, though, we do have to start off this entire flip by talking about something very important. What you're going to do right now is you're going to just write this first bullet point, okay? Just that first bullet point. You're going to put a star next to it and say, the Spanish were told by others about the gold that was in Mexico. So some of the Taino people that Columbus came into contact with were wearing gold jewelry. Now, this gold jewelry indicated to the Spanish that there is gold nearby. At least there's some in the Caribbean. Columbus asked many of these Taino people, said, how much more of this is left? They said, we don't have a lot here, but there are people over there on the mainland that have a ton of it. And they were referring, of course, to the Aztec, right? Now, something that you need to understand before we go any further, okay, is that the Aztecs are very important, okay? So I'm going to make my screen big now so we can talk about them a little bit. So in your notes right now, you should have the Aztec Empire, aka the Aztecs. You're going to need to write down about 4 or 5 really important things that I'm going to be talking about. Basically, you're going to be needing to note down the things that make the Aztec very intelligent, that show that they were a very diverse civilization, and that shows that they were very ahead of their time. And I'm not kidding when I tell you this. The Aztec were seriously like the Rome of North America. So the Romans that we talked about, remember, I know a lot of y'all really enjoyed that unit, but when we talked about the Romans had sophisticated writing styles. They had a sophisticated religious structure, architecture, things like that. So important thing to note is that the Aztecs are much like this. The Aztecs also, in many modern day ways, are called the Aztec Empire because of where they're located. They actually were located really based out of this main capital city. So the thing about it is the Aztec Empire, aka the Aztecs, were headquartered right here at a place called Tenochtitlan, right? Or Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was a massive city that rivaled the architecture of Rome. Look at these pyramids that had these houses on top that they would use for religious structures. This entire city also was home to over 1 million people. And the bananas part about this entire entire city is the fact that it was built by Native Americans. Native Americans had large-scale architecture, had a writing system, had all these different artisanal social classes and not artisanal social classes that included artisans and people like serfs. They had landowners and nobles and all these other things that Europeans had as well. The Aztecs, of course, just lacked large domesticated animals, and they lacked forgeable metals. Apparently, the Aztecs had just started actually smelting bronze by the time the Spanish got there, so they didn't know how to develop it into anything yet. Also, interesting little fact about the Aztecs is where their city is founded. It's founded on top of a lake. And I'm not even kidding when I say that. Literally on top of a giant lake, their capital city was founded. That means that the Aztecs were so intelligent that they figured out how to build a city on top of water. And some of you are like, how do you farm and stuff on top of water? Well, first of all, why'd they choose that place? So going into Spanish culture, especially Mexican heritage, when you're looking at the country of Mexico in the modern era, their flag is a very important symbol. So this is the flag of Mexico, and this right here is the eagle symbol that exists inside the middle of the Mexican flag. That right there is an Aztec symbol. According to legend, the Aztecs knew where they were going to found their city when they saw an eagle clutching a snake standing on top of a cactus. And apparently the Aztecs, when they were wandering around trying to find out where they wanted to found their original place, saw an eagle with a snake on top of a cactus inside the middle of this lake, right? Inside the middle of this very, very large lake, which is located where modern Mexico City, DF, is actually located. So that symbol on the Mexican flag is an Aztec symbol to just give you some kind of understanding of how important these people are to the culture of Central and South America. Well, mainly Central America. So going into it as well, look at the massive ring-like city that they actually built off of. Every time they wanted to add to their city, they would just build extra rings. And also, they even learned how to farm on top of the water. They literally built islands, okay? Write this word down. It's a very, very good word to know for the short answer whenever you get to it on the test. Chinampas. Chinampas, right? Chinampas were these literal islands that the Aztecs built out of mud and reed mats. What the Aztecs would do is they would take reeds that floated really, really well in water and weave them together. And then they would put a layer of mud, and then another reed mat and a layer of mud, and another reed mat and a layer of mud, and another reed mat and a layer of mud. And they would make and stack all of this stuff one on top of the other, and then they would float it out into the middle of the lake. Now, I know some of y'all right now are asking the question Crystal Lara is probably like, wait a minute, but then how did they make sure it stayed in one spot? Well, apparently the Aztecs would then plant a tree on the corners of those Chinampas. The tree's roots would grow down into the lake to get water and then anchor itself into place at the bottom of the lake. That's ridiculous. The Aztecs literally learned how to farm on top of water and make systems to where they didn't need to water their plants. The plants naturally got their water from the lake directly beneath their feet. That's insane! And then on top of everything else, the Aztecs had a very sophisticated military structure and a social class system. This right here is actually considered to be their, lords of their states. And they were actually military fighters. And as you can see, they're holding a very specific type of weapon. This is a big thing in Aztec culture as well. The Aztecs literally made swords out of lava, all right? So they didn't have access to bronze or iron. Well, they just got access to bronze, but it was 5 minutes ago. But they didn't have access to those metals for a very long time. So the Aztecs developed weapons that no one else in North America had ever seen. They actually took glass. Obsidian is what it's called. Basically, it's what it is. It's cooled lava, and they would take it and chip it off into sharp razor blade-like things and stick it into the edges of their wood and make swords that no one else around them had, which could cleave through human skin like that. And so what this is going to do, though, for the Aztecs is it's going to make their ability to expand phenomenally intense. This right here, everything in yellow, is actually the stuff that the Aztecs took over. So Tenochtitlan is right here. That's their capital city in the middle of that massive lake. All these other cities are people that the Aztecs took over, okay? So as you can see, the Aztec Empire is what they turned into. And who does this look a lot like? A lot like Rome when we talked about Rome, right? The expansion of one city over tons and tons of different other people, right? The Romans took over barbarians. The Aztec took over other cities and villages and other types of people nearby them. Now, this is another really important aspect about the Aztec. It doesn't necessarily show like how intelligent they are, but it is a symbol of their very intelligent religious structure. They were a polytheistic religious structure, and every single time they would take over one of these cities or cultural groups, they would force these cities to pay a tax. And what that tax was they would have to donate a person to be sacrificed. Now, something that's very intense about Aztec religion is that this is something that kind of scared the Spanish a lot, and they were like, oh, we gotta convert them as soon as possible, is the Aztecs would actually sacrifice people to their gods, right? They believed particularly in one huge flying serpent god named Quetzalcoatl, which was a giant white flying snake that would destroy them if they didn't offer him human hearts, right? So what they would do is they would actually sacrifice human beings to this god by cutting open their chest and ripping their heart out, right? And offering it up to their god that flew above them. And sometimes in certain festivals, they would actually sacrifice hundreds of people, sometimes 200 people a day. And then also, they would take the heart while it was still beating and then put it into one of these. It's called a jaguar jar. And they would stack the jars up, and then they would literally kick the body down the steps of this temple. And as you can see, it was a very, very intense society. But what I'm getting at here in this entire grand understanding is just to help you understand that these people are not someone that should have been taken lightly. They are not like when you think of Native Americans, people being semi-nomadic and moving around to find their food, and much like the North American tribes, these people were heavily sophisticated, had large-scale architecture, had all of these other amazing things, but then the Spanish are going to show up and ruin it, right? So now what we're going to do is, now that you have some stuff about the Aztecs that you can add in, now we're going to get into the main bulk of this entire thing and talk about what happened to them. So the Aztecs are going to be taken over by this guy, right? A man by the name of Hernan Cortes. So Hernan Cortes was a Spanish conquistador, much like Columbus. Now, Hernan Cortes, notice I have meanie right here, is a huge jerk, right? Like, this guy literally in history, by any historian's recollection or any records, will tell you that he is not a good guy, okay? First and foremost, Cortes wasn't even supposed to be on this job. Cortes was not even supposed to be the one that went over after the Aztecs and got after him. He was living in Cuba at the time, at a Spanish colony, where they were planning and preparing an expedition to go over and possibly interact with the Aztecs and or conquest them. So he wasn't even supposed to be the guy for the job. The guy that was going to be sent on the job mysteriously one morning showed up dead, and he was murdered and stabbed to death. And then they ran out to the harbor to see the ships that guy was supposed to take over to Mexico, and they were gone. And what had happened was Cortes took command of this entire quest and goes off on his own. And when he gets there and when he lands on the coast of Mexico, this is a great little fact that I'll know that you listen to this flip because it's going to be on your warm-up. When he landed in this place, he actually literally said, "None of you will leave here without our conquest of glory." And he set all of his ships on fire. Cortes literally burned his own boats down in the harbor outside of the Aztec capital, being like, "Look, we're here. There is no turning back. We are not going back without getting as much gold and things from these people as we possibly can." And so once he gets off his boats and he starts interacting with all these different people, he actually eventually meets two interpreters, right? So he meets a disgraced Spanish priest, this guy that was living there who could speak Maya, and then he meets a woman who was a female slave that actually could speak Aztec. So what would happen is every time they needed to talk to an Aztec person or somebody taken over by the Aztecs, she would speak to the Aztec and then translate it into Maya to that priest, and then that priest would translate it into Spanish and tell Cortes. And apparently something was lost in translation at one point because something really literally made its way down the translation line, and Cortes heard from one of these people that the Aztec had taken over, that they had so much gold that they didn't even know what to do with all of it, right? So the big thing that's going to happen is Cortes is going to start heading towards Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, and every single time he meets a group of people that the Aztec had taken over in their Mexica Empire, he would actually make an alliance with them. So basically what he was doing is he was creating an alliance of the people that hated the Aztec, because they had to sacrifice people to them all the time, right? So because they had to donate their people to the Aztec to be sacrificed in these ceremonies. The people that the Aztec took over did not like the Aztec. They did not want to be under the reign of the Aztec because they had to donate human life to them all the time, right? So he stops along the way and he makes alliances with these people that are in the Aztec, trying to basically create an army, because Cortes only has about 200 guys, 12 cannons, and some horses. So how are you going to take over a city with over 1 million people in it? Well, what had happened was Moctezuma, all right? So let's talk really quickly about this guy. Moctezuma is the king of the Aztecs at this point. The Aztecs believed that Moctezuma was an extension of God, right? They thought that he was a part of their religion, that he was a representative of all of the other gods and a god himself. So Moctezuma heard that the Spanish were nearby. He's not an idiot, right? Like, he's not dumb. He doesn't like hear about these people over in the Caribbean showing up with metal armor and guns and all these other things and not going to hear about it. So he hears of them, and there's a very common myth that is actually written right here. He apparently heard about their approach and thought that they may be gods too. That's actually not true. I've done a lot of research over the years and have purposely left this little line in there just to make sure that kids aren't muting my flips and stuff like that still. He did not think that they were gods. He knew that they were human beings. He just knew that they were phenomenally way more advanced than they were. So he sent gifts and a message of, please come no closer. So apparently people came to inspect the city and then also meet Cortes. And they were emissaries of Moctezuma, people he had sent. And when they arrived to talk to Cortes, they had with them jaguar pelts and feathers and gold and all these other items and honey and things like that. And they gave these gifts to Cortes, being like, okay, here's some stuff. Now please come no further. Stay out of Tenochtitlan and do not come and attack us. There is some stuff. Now please leave. But Cortes came anyway. He took these gifts and he was like, look at all this gold. I bet you they have more. I'm going to make sure that nobody's going to charge me for murder when I get back to Cuba. And I'm going to make sure that when these boats show up to come get us, that we fill them with all of these prizes. Those were the gifts Moctezuma sent. And so Cortes just puts them in his bag, keeps heading on towards Tenochtitlan anyway. And along the way, stops at every village he can find and makes alliances with the people that the Aztec had taken over, right? And so as everything goes forward, Moctezuma then sees Cortes for the first time, because Cortes came anyway, and Moctezuma was like, ah ha ha, oh no. And he apparently, though, decides to welcome Cortes into the city. He's like, look, if he's going to be here, we might as well welcome him open, because if we try to fight them right now, things might not go the way that we want them to. So the first thing the Spanish try to do is, what do we think happened? Convert Moctezuma and the Aztecs to Christianity. Now, a lot of people now, like a lot of historians, believe that Cortes is a lot like a lot of other Spaniards that didn't really necessarily want to convert these people to Christianity. They wanted to use their non-conversion as a reason to take them over when they denied Christianity. So they wanted to convert, or Cortes wants to convert the Aztecs to Christianity. The Aztecs are going to resist this. Moctezuma's like, I'm not going to walk out there and then pretend that I'm now like a different religion when the people that I rule over believe that I am a god, a part of our own religion. So Cortes apparently then takes Moctezuma as prisoner. He takes him as a prisoner and he wants to hold him hostage. And he says, okay, fine, you want to play this game? I'm going to walk you out on this balcony and you're going to tell all the people down there on top, near this giant pyramid that he sits on top of, I'm going to walk you out there and you are going to tell them to give over their goods and wares to us, and that you are not a god and that you are actually going to be one of our slaves. And so he brings him out onto this this big balcony and threatens his life. And the Aztecs are like, it's not very godlike of our king to be giving over to our enemies that are here to destroy us. And actually, the people in the crowd threw rocks and pummeled the Spanish and Moctezuma and ended up killing him with rocks, right? And so the Aztecs then grabbed all their weapons, their obsidian blades, and they fought off the Spanish, which is absolutely bananas to think about. The Aztec military beat the Spanish in the fight. Those 200 men that Cortes was with, those horses and cannons they had to turn and run because over 1,000 Aztecs were coming at them, right? And so the big thing about it is the Aztecs won. They pushed the Spanish out. They endured a lot of casualties, but they pushed them out. But remember, what had Cortes been doing the entire time? He had been making allies with the people that hated the Aztecs. So he goes back, recruits an army of all these people, and then comes back to Tenochtitlan to take over the place completely. Now, the big thing about it is he's going to have the ability to do this due to the fact that since the Spanish had shown up, a large number of the Aztecs begin to die. From, what do we think? Smallpox, right? The Aztecs had been exposed to smallpox now from the Spanish that actually had shown up, and so now a lot of them are dying, and the Spanish are going to sweep into Tenochtitlan and destroy everything. They're going to rip down their statues, destroy their idols, completely bring the Aztec people under their control, and they are going to basically pillage the entire city to take over all of their things. Now, a big thing that's also going to happen as well, another major event that goes down, is another guy takes over a different area, right? And his name is Francisco Pizarro. So now what we're doing is we're changing gears a little bit, and we're going to leave Cortes where he was, being an awful person, taking over the Aztecs, and we're going to talk about how Francisco Pizarro is going to take over the Inca, right? So now what I need you to do, just write this very first bullet point, okay? Just that very, very first bullet point. And we're going to talk about the Inca a little bit and give you another little bit of thing to talk about. So now what you're going to do is say the Spanish adventurer Francisco Pizarro, who is actually a cousin of Hernan Cortes, wants to take over the Inca, which is in modern-day Peru. They're also a super advanced people as well. Now, to give you a little bit of understanding, what you need to do now is you need to actually go ahead and give me a little title in your notes that says the Inca, and you're going to want to do the same thing that you did for the Aztecs. You're going to want to jot a few things down, right? So the Inca are from modern-day Peru, okay? Peru is a mountainous area in South America. As you can see, it is placed in the mountainous area known as the Andes, right? So the Andes is a very, very high mountainous terrain place where the Inca are going to create their settlements. And I bet you a bunch of you have seen this place before. That right there is one of the Incan cities known as Machu Picchu. It's one of my top 10 places I have to go to before I die. I'm very, very excited to go there. I'm hoping to possibly go there this year, which would be a lot of fun. Now, the cool thing about it, though, is as you can see, the Inca were wildly sophisticated as well, just like the Aztec. They actually conquered and took over a huge mountain territory, and write this down, this is bananas. A part of these cities, they were networked over these different mountain ranges with over 10,000 miles of trade roads, right? So the Inca took over a huge area that would be connected by roads that cut through these mountains, and over 10,000 miles of roads would network all of the Incan cities together, right? And so Incan cities were very, very large, just like Tenochtitlan. This one is Machu Picchu. It's their religious capital. They had a very large capital as well called Cusco, right? And Cusco, just like the guy from Emperor's New Groove, of course, being referenced in that entire, naming of his character. Now, the big thing about it, though, going forward, is that the Inca, just like the Aztecs being that sophisticated, did things a little bit differently. One important thing to note, difference between Incans and Aztecs, Aztecs did have a written language. The Incans did not. The Incans actually only communicated using number systems, that they would actually tie knots into threads, and depending on the color of thread and the number of knots, it would identify how many of an item they were moving along these trade routes. These little things right here were called quipus. Quipu is spelled Q-U-I-P-U. So they had a very sophisticated number system that would actually be using knots and thread, right? So going further, they also domesticated these bad boys. Llamas, right? So the Incas literally created and bred the animal known as a llama. Now, why did they actually breed these animals? Why are they so important? First of all, they're a cousin of apparently a North American camel that existed for a long time. But the llamas would be used by the Inca in their farming systems, right? Llamas can only carry about 60 to 70 pounds. So you can't ride one because you're just too heavy, right? And so what I'm getting at is 60 or 70 pounds, though, they used llamas to help move product up and down their different mountainous farming regions. Because I'm sure some of you have probably thought of up until this point, you're like, wait a minute, you lived in the mountains. How do you farm in the mountains? So I know that the Aztecs farmed on top of water using man-made islands called Chinampas. What the Incans did is they would terrace the land on these mountains. Terracing basically means is that they would dig out land to make it flat, and then they would actually build a little stair step up and dig another flat area. So everywhere you see flat land up here, that's where the Incans would farm. And they would actually terrace the land perfectly, making these stair-stepped fields so they could farm in these different areas. And as I said, this is really sophisticated stuff. And a lot of people, a lot of teachers usually just write a lot of these people off. They're like, oh, the Incans and the Aztecs were there and the Spanish took them over. We're not about that. We're about understanding that the Inca and the Aztec are proud people from the original area of Latin America, and they were highly sophisticated. They just lacked large domesticated animals and also forgeable metals, right? Now, another big thing right here that's really, really intense is this is an image of Incan human sacrifice, right? So the Incans, just like a lot of the other major cultures like the Aztecs, they also had a religious structure that included human sacrifice, right? So now, unlike the Aztecs who would cut your heart out and offer it up to their god, it would still be beating, what the Incans would do differently is they would sacrifice children, okay? The Incans sacrificed kids, usually ones under the age of 15, okay? So, like, now, typically, these Incans that were sacrificed were, like, pure. They had never actually been married or anything like that. And what they would do is an Incan priest would apparently take them up into the mountains. And apparently it was also a great honor for your child to be sacrificed to the Incan religion, right? Like, I would be honored to donate Pierre to be sacrificed to the Incan gods in their culture. I would never do that, though, because he's a baby. Now, the big thing, though, about it is this woman right here, or this child, was only about 15 years old when she was sacrificed. And this child is over 500 years old. Some of you are like, what are you talking about 500 years old? Check this out. The way that Incans would sacrifice children is that they would bring them up into the mountains, usually give them alcohol or coca leaves or something like that to chew on to kind of put them into a state where they didn't really know what was going on, and a priest would literally bludgeon them to death by beating them to death with a stick, or they would strangle them to death, right? And so what would then happen is they would mummify these human sacrifices, right? So that right there is an Incan mummy that was actually preserved due to the high altitude of the Andes and also the very, very cold conditions up there. But that right there is literally a child mummy from the Incan sacrificial religion, which is crazy. And that right there is a picture of Pizarro, and he's a huge jerk, and he's also, like, of course, like Cortes' cousin. But this guy is very, very important, and this is the very last thing that I want you to write down for this flip. That is the Incan king, and he is going to be on your test in your matching section, so you need to know who he is. His name is Atahualpa, and the way you spell that is Atahaulpa. Atahualpa. And so what we're going to do right now in class when we pick up off this is we're going to start talking about the Incans. They're very sophisticated like religion, but we're also going to talk about a very big moment throughout history known as the Battle of Cajamarca. But I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.